He won the Nobel Peace Prize, but is struggling to maintain peace in his own country. A social media post sparked protests and a wave of violence, reigniting a rivalry many thought had ended. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the standoff between Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and activist Jawar Mohammed. After just a few months in office, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was able to make peace with neighbor and longtime foe Eritrea, bringing an end to a decades-long political and military stalemate. But a year and a half into his term, it looks like he's going to have to come up with a second peace plan. Among his many reforms, which included sacking corrupt officials and pardoning those who'd been labeled as terrorists, Abiy also welcomed back critics of the government who'd gone into exile. One of them was Jawar Mohammed, a US-based activist and media mogul from the Oromo ethnic group who was instrumental in helping sweep Abiy into power. He himself has turned from friend to foe and now threatens that same power. His claim on social media that government security forces were organizing an attack against him triggered nationwide protests that quickly morphed into deadly violence with ethnic and religious undertones. We'll debate the causes and look at possible solutions later in the show. But first, Adam Pletz takes a look at how those clashes began.
Weeks after Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, violence erupted in Addis Ababa and other parts of the country. Abiy says 86 people were killed in late October, mostly in fighting between ethnic groups, but also at the hands of security forces. 5 police officers also died. Many more people were wounded.
They killed my brother, and I was standing in front of my brother's dead body. Then they came and beat me with stones, and they slashed open my lower abdomen.
The unrest began when political activist and media owner Jawar Mohammed said police tried to remove his personal bodyguards. That led his supporters to rally outside his house. Jawar believes security forces intended to orchestrate his assassination. The former ally of Abiy is now an outspoken critic of the Prime Minister.
He is resorting to the early signs of dictatorship, of trying to intimidate people, even with his very close allies, individuals who helped him come to power, who happen to disagree with some of the policies and positions, ideologies he's advocating. You know, intimidation is the start of authoritarian rule.
Abiy was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last month for ending the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But residents on the border say they're not reaping the dividends of peace.
If there is no free movement from both sides, what is the point of the peace deal? They say there's peace. However, we've got big problems along the border.
Critics say Abiy's Peace Prize was awarded prematurely. They argue the Nobel Peace Committee gave it to him as a reward for his bold domestic reforms, including releasing political prisoners and granting press freedoms. But with general elections in May, Abiy faces the challenge of unifying a country that has ethnic divisions enshrined in its constitution. According to government figures, more than 1 million Ethiopians have been displaced by ethnic violence since Abiy came to power. Can Abiy's reforms curb the violence, or are they part of the cause as ethnic political parties respond to what they view as his attempts to centralize power? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Jawar Mohammed had agreed to join us on the program but failed to show up at the last minute, unfortunately. So to look at the challenges Abiy Ahmed is facing and assess how he's handling them, let's go to Juba, South Sudan, where we're joined by Adem Abebe. He's an advisor and commentator on the African Union and a program officer with the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. And in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is Goitom Gebreluel. He's a researcher with the Center for African Studies at the International Law and Policy Institute, currently conducting doctoral studies at the University of Cambridge. Good to have you both on the program. Adem Abebe, Does Jawar Mohammed have a strong case here and a strong point? Are they actively targeting him?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. It would have been really better if we had him on the show to speak about the incident.
Exactly.
But obviously, what is clear is that Jawar Mohammed has quite a large following among his Oromo ethnic groups. And he was provided security partly in the same manner as other exiled politicians who returned home after the reforms that Abiy Ahmed brought in. And the allegation, what he said, was there was an attempt to remove his security at midnight, which obviously would concern anyone. And he was concerned indeed, and he posted a story narrating exactly what happened, which then provoked the protests in and around Oromia. Now, is he being targeted? That's a very difficult question, but what I can say is that the Prime Minister, a few days before the incident, had indicated that individuals with foreign passports were trying to influence the political situation in the country,
right,
and that they were provoking instability. And everybody, including Jawar, understood this to be, again, seem that he was the target of that particular speech, but there was no indication that anything serious would follow up from that particular speech. So it's very difficult to tell, but it's very difficult to also dismiss his fears.
Okay.
I think anyone whose
right.
security is removed at midnight would
right.
be concerned.
Right.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, more than 80 people died in the aftermath. Goitom, does the buck stop with the Prime Minister? Is he to blame for this sequence of events?
To some extent. I think making that type of threat, if you cannot follow through with it, is not particularly wise. And given the very fragile security situation in the country, and given the fact that that statement was understood by everyone to be directed at Jawar Mohammed, and thirdly, given the fact that Jawar Mohammed has a very large constituency in the Oromo ethnic group, particularly the young demographics, that was not very wise. That was a strategically unwise choice, and the consequences, as we saw, was a worsening of the security situation, and around 80 people that were killed, and Abiy Ahmed standing generally, I think, in the Oromia region, to a great extent, was diminished because of that. So regardless of the moral case and the legal case that Abiy Ahmed had, I think it was strategically unwise for him to make that statement in Parliament.
Right. And Adem, so we saw protesters in the east in the aftermath burning Abiy's book in the town of Dadar. A lot of people showing support for Jawar Mohammed, showing their anger, signaling their anger towards Abiy Ahmed. Are we in a situation now where, as we've seen in the past, the Oromia region could explode into violence and could become ungovernable in many ways?
Well, I don't think that's going to happen, but obviously the situation was a reflection of the tension that was brewing in the region. It's a big region, a big constituency in the country, but it's also not a unified region, as some commentators sometimes put it. So there's a sort of a clash of ideas between those who support Jawar's idea, which narrates an Ethiopian history where the Oromo were specific victims, and based on that, he wishes to continue the current system. And you have Abiy Ahmed, who believes that we need to recognize the past, but at the same time transcend it. So I don't think it will lead to any ungovernable situations of ungovernability, anything worse than it actually is at the moment. As you may know, there has been instability and insecurity in the region. There's a breakdown of law and order, not just in Oromia, but across the country. And perhaps the protests and the killings were a reflection of that lack of enforcement in certain areas. But I don't think it will make it worse. If anything, I think it led to a conversation among the Oromo community, including Abiy Ahmed going around the region to appease some of the concerns that a lot of people had. So counterintuitively, it may actually have led to a sort of soul searching. And hopefully that will lead to better circumstances rather than the worsening of the situation.
Yes, Goitom, all things considered, it seems to be easier to make peace with Eritrea than to solve Ethiopia's internal problems. I guess we can say the honeymoon is over, right? Are we seeing the reality here? Abiy can say a lot of good things, initially do a few good things, but the reality of governing this nation is an altogether different beast.
Yes, that was evident a few months after he came to power, I think. And I think, you know, the Ethiopian population and to a great extent the international community, we need to take responsibility for the fact that we put so much hope in one individual. The reality in Ethiopia, the institutional reality, for example, is that it's a very decentralized state structure. And also the EPRDF itself is rather decentralized. So what one individual could achieve was very limited. And the fact that we allowed this Abiy mania to actually emerge is something that we as a community need to take responsibility for, I think, because there was very little him as an individual could do, and we sort of contributed collectively to propagate that idea that one individual could actually solve all the problems. And what we see now is that we need a broader political settlement that involves, first of all, the elements within the EPRDF, and then a broader settlement that involves individuals such as Jawar Mohammed and other armed groups that need to sort of sit down and talk out a roadmap, a political roadmap for the next year, how we're going to conduct elections and so forth. So there was very little Abiy Ahmed as an individual could do from the outset. So that was simply an illusion, I think.
Right, and then I wonder, Goitom, do you subscribe to this idea that the EPRDF has core members who are seen as the more seasoned members, the deep state, some would call them, who don't want to roll over and let their power die easily? They're behind the scenes, they're still within the bloodstream of ruling the country, and perhaps they're tinged with more authoritarianism than democracy. And that's an internal hurdle that he needs to overcome, and it's not going to be easy. Is that how you see it as well?
No, not really. I mean, those elements, I think, is, you know, indirectly what people are talking about is the old security establishment and the TPLF. And they have, you know, a limited amount of influence in Ethiopia today. And there are a number of various groups in Ethiopia today that don't really require external groups to tell them to fight each other. And one of those, you know, conflicts is the one we saw last week between Abiy Ahmed, the ODP, and Jawar Mohammed's constituency. So you don't actually need external groups to meddle in these situations and fuel these conflicts, because, you know, all the different groups in Ethiopia today have, many of them have irreconcilable ideological views. Many of them have irreconcilable power needs. So, you know, all of this could happen without external groups fueling the fire.
Right. So, okay, so Adem, are his problems the fact that he's not, I mean, maybe I should break it down into sort of three different strands here. Are Abiy's problems the fact that he's not sincere himself as this peace-loving Democrat that we think he is, or that he has too many internal problems within the EPRDF and the already existing governing institutions, or that the country is just really very hard to govern because of the multiple ethnicities and languages, and the federal system's really tough to keep a hold of because it's a massive country with a lot of complexity? Which one is most likely to be true?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors. Obviously, most of the issues that Abiy is facing today, he did not create them. They were inherited. And if you look at the EPRDF, I think its stability was actually founded on asymmetrical power relationships. There was a strong constituency within the EPRDF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, And its superiority was what actually kept the EPRDF united. But they were always a challenge. And I think the protest that erupted in 2015 brought that difference out, that strengthened the parties, the weaker parties within the EPRDF, particularly the Oromo Democratic Party today and the Amhara Democratic Party. And the divisions became more nuanced. But I think it was the asymmetry within the party that kept the party together. And ethnicity also cannot be dismissed. It has been an issue for 5-6 decades. And now, you know, a lot of people question the ethnic basis of the federal arrangement. As you may know, we have ethnic-based territories, ethnic-based parties, ethnic-based security arrangements. And it has proved quite a combustible combination. So, you know, there is an element of weakness within the party, structural weakness, that when the asymmetry within the party was removed, it essentially led to a fragmentation within the party. And combined with the ethnic rhetoric that has been established by the political class, it was easy to see that the combination would create some of the insecurities that we see today. So I think I would say it's a combination of things, one leading to the other.
Goitom Gebreluel, did the Nobel Committee succumb to Abiy mania?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it depends on what the basis for awarding the prize is. If the basis is effort and intention, you know, I think you can reward his peacemaking efforts and intentions. I don't think Abiy Ahmed is a sinister person. I think he, quite the opposite, I think he made a very genuine effort to, you know, extend an olive branch to all his opponents. On the other hand, if the criteria is outcome, I don't think there's a good case for awarding the prize, because we haven't had a peaceful year in Ethiopia this year, and we're not looking at a peaceful year ahead of us either. Essentially, we've had, you know, a very conflictual year, and peacemaking efforts by the current administration has not been one that can be characterized as a success.
Adem, what would you advise Abiy Ahmed to do right now?
Well, for me, fundamentally, a lot of people consider the internal problems of the country as inter-ethnic. But what drives this conflict is competition within ethnic groups, particularly within the Oromos and within the Amharas, the two largest ethnic groups in the country. So I think rather than working towards a larger settlement, a countrywide settlement, it would be advisable to start within ethnic groups. And there are some indications already within both regions towards kind of creating a level of agreement, a level of consensus. Abiy Ahmed, as I said, had initiated an agreement, cooperative agreement within the parties in Oromia. And they are starting to renew it in the aftermath of the conflict, the post-Jawar conflict. And very recently as well, the political parties in the Amhara region have sat together and agreed to work together. Obviously, these are initial steps. But I think once there is a stronger understanding, a stronger consensus within these ethnic groups, and then it will be easier to have the political settlement that Goitom was referring to earlier.
Right.
But it's important to start within the ethnic groups. So I hope Abiy will strengthen that effort.
Okay, well, we hope to tackle this again, and hopefully next time Jawar Mohammed does show up, because I'm really looking forward to asking him a few very important questions. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you, Adem Abebe and Goitom Gebreluel. Thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Even before this latest round of ethnic violence, Ethiopia ranked 131st out of 163 countries on the 2019 Global Peace Index. It had actually moved up 8 spots from the previous year. But the planet's least peaceful nation, Afghanistan, it ranked dead last below Syria. But surprisingly, the index found that overall, the world is a more peaceful place. How did they come to this conclusion? Well, earlier I asked the man behind the list, Steve Killalay, who let us know what criteria was used to compile the list and who made the top spot.
There are 3 different domains which we measure, and they have 23 different composite indicators. So the first dimension's internal safety and security. So that measures things like the level of violent crime, the homicide rates, the availability of small arms, incarceration rates, number of police, number of terrorist attacks, state-sponsored terror, and other such things. The next, the 3 domains is internal and external conflict, and that's probably self-evident. And the final one is militarisation. Now, we look at the structure of the index. It gets derived from a definition which is the absence of violence or fear of violence. And we have an international expert committee which oversees it, which consists of experts in peace and statistics who then determine what indicators we use, the weight of those indicators. The sources of the information we get aren't our own judgments. We do construct a couple of the indicators, but it's mainly sourced from the best sources we can available globally.
People would understand why Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, these are at the bottom of the list because terrible wars are happening in these places. Yemen, for example. I guess they'd also understand why a place like Iceland is fairly peaceful, no internal conflicts, quite remote, and so on. But when the report comes out, and a part of the extrapolation and interpretation is that the world in general is getting more peaceful. They look at the news cycle, and part of our job is to only report on the problems and the terrible things, right? They find it hard to believe that the world is actually a more peaceful place than it was last year. Is that a surprising interpretation?
Look, no, I don't think it is, because if we go back to 2014, and the index has been dropping every year since then up until this year, it was really on the back of the rise of ISIS, the way it then unleashed its terror through Iraq and then moved on in through Syria. And what we've seen over the last 18 months is pretty much the territorial defeat of ISIS. We can also see there's 13% less deaths from conflict in Syria, let's say, and that's the reason that Syria has moved up. Afghanistan really hasn't changed in terms of wars, but Syria is just slightly more peaceful.
Any countries that are rapidly going up?
Yes. Well, what we find is quite often after the back of a conflict, you find that there's already big drops in peace. You find there'll be increases. So we're looking this year. Sudan was one of the ones which did increase, but the cut-off date was before. It was the 31st of March, which was before the recent unrest. And Egypt also, after the series of issues which it's had over the last 5 years, it's bounded quite a bit too. But if we go right to the top of the index, probably the standout there's Bhutan. So if we go back over the last 13 years, it's increased 43 places on the index to now stand at number 15.
Yeah, so part of your statistics here say that violence is costing the world more than $14 trillion a year, and that number equates to 11.2% of world economic activity. I wonder, when you put out that figure, what are you trying to tell people?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that the cost of violence to the global economy is significant. If we can reduce that, that then frees up economic wealth, which can then be put into other areas, which can then stimulate and improve the global economy. So so violence comes with an economic cost. And one of the things which I think is really important with the index, we're not making moral judgments about where countries stand. Yes, let's face it, you border Syria, you're going to get a lot of very nasty spillover effects.
Right. Because
you need a big military.
Right, of course.
You've
because
got
you're
violent criminals.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you're going to get people who say, yes, it's all well and good. I'd love to use that money to build schools and hospitals and put it into education and so on, but I'm fighting a terrorist group. Let the less bad guys defeat the more bad guys first, and then we'll put that money to good use. So with that in mind, I guess you're never expecting to go out of business anytime soon, are you?
So, look, I don't think any of us can actually imagine a world which is absolutely peaceful. Hasn't existed in history, doesn't do now. But we can all probably imagine a world which could be 10% more peaceful. Now, if you look at that, that's about $1.4 trillion. Now, $1.4 trillion is the size of all foreign direct investment last year, or put it another way, it's the size of the total economies of, let's say, Ireland, Denmark, and Switzerland. So these are large amounts of money. Even 1% of the cost of violence, the global economy is 140 billion, and that's the size of all overseas developmental aid.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.